Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work for social justice.
You see, you do stuff like that, and it throws me off. Each week, we bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another and keeping each other on our toes.
Yes, apparently
That's how you learn things on the learning edge. And Damien, you're up this week. What are you bringing to the table today?
I am. Well, first of all, let me acknowledge the fact that I sound like this because I am also sick. Not really. I'm getting over being sick and have a little sinus infection. So sorry, folks. Anyway, I have brought, even though when you all are hearing this, it's December, I have brought our November book to the table for us to talk about today. The book is called Class Struggle Unionism, and it was written by Joe Burns, who is this long-time union organizer and negotiator, as well as a labor lawyer. He's also currently the director of collective bargaining for the Association of Flight Attendants, which is pretty cool. Yeah. And he's written 2 other books as well. So he's definitely an expert, I think, and a great person to learn from here. I know I mentioned this last week, but I was excited to choose this book in particular for us because we've done some really great learning work this year on unions and on class, which has all been really important, I think, and really eye-opening for me. So this book felt like a great way for us to continue that. And I thought this book was great. In this book, Joe Burns shares a bit of the history and characteristics of unionism in all its forms and lots of examples of unions and their work throughout history. But then he really hones in on this idea of class struggle unionism and this idea that that kind of unionism produces the type of unionism that he argues we need, right? One that centers the fight for major class issues for all workers, given the context of employment and labor being exploitative. And I think he does such a great job in this book. He really packs it with so many examples of that and what we can and should do to create the kind of labor movement that we really and truly need. So yeah, I'm so excited to talk about this book today. Where do you want to start? What did you think of it?
Well, I thought it was great,
too.
Good. It's really great insight into like union theory.
Yes.
With some really good history thrown in too. I think this book points out the inherent exploitations of work, as you alluded to, from the very beginning, and argues that class struggle unionism is going to be the best path forward for challenging that exploitation.
Right.
For me, this quote from the introduction really set the tone for the rest of the book, where he said, quote, "Those of us who want a militant, democratic, anti-racist, anti-sexist, and fighting labor movement have a choice. Piecemeal reform is not going to work. Our unionism must become a lot more bold, a lot more radical, a lot more strategic, and a lot less willing to accept the status quo. We need a new framework." So he goes on to explain that framework as class struggle unionism, which he says is a distinct philosophy from the current models that have been used by things like the AFL-CIO and the SEIU, but closer to something from the International Workers of the World, the IWW, from years and years ago. One of the key features of this, which I kind of alluded to, is challenging the existence and power of the super rich, the billionaires, in favor of the working class, and that being an inherent reason for unions to exist.
Right.
Is seeing that struggle between classes and the different experiences that people have access to because of that class being a key component of class struggle unionism.
Absolutely. And again, centering them in sort of this work and this fight. Yeah.
Yep.
I thought that was a great quote from the introduction. I'm pretty sure I highlighted it too. I think for me, it gave me a sense of why this notion and this work of class struggle unionism is so important and so powerful and just so necessary. I think, we've talked about this on the podcast before, right, in sort of many different contexts, but anything that is sort of radical, I think just feels necessary, especially given the world we live in, the problems that we face in every facet of our lives, and certainly work is one of them, like our jobs, our employment is one of them. So I'm so glad you shared that quote. Sort of related to that, I think one of the things I appreciated in this book, and this actually jumps us all the way to chapter 4, highlighted a lot in chapter 4, was this idea that the fight against racism and sexism has to be a central component of class struggle unionism, right? And I think, he makes it clear that that's what separates class struggle unionism from business unionism, which he spends a lot of time talking about. In that chapter, he shares a lot about how this country was founded on slavery and how that's permeated every fabric of not only the country, but also our notions of wealth and how we distribute wealth and who holds wealth, and also about our employment market to this day. And business unionism, I think, really has also kept sexism alive and gender discrimination as part of our workplaces for so long. And so one of the quotes I pulled from chapter 4 was this. He says, quote, "A defining feature of business unionism is a narrow focus on the interest of a group of workers in a plant or craft. This leads to a conservative form of unionism that tries to get limited gains for a handful of workers while ignoring the rest of the working class. This plays into the hand of the billionaires who rely on keeping workers divided to maintain their system of exploitation. Class struggle unionists, in contrast, believe in something bigger and frankly more inspiring. Seeing labor's struggle as part of a broader working class conflict, they link labor struggles with other fights. They fight for the unemployed, for single-payer health care, and for issues benefiting the entire working class. But it also means that class struggle unionists fight against attempts to divide the working class, such as racism, sexism, and anti-immigration policies."
Yeah.
Right? And so for me, class struggle unionism is not only more inclusive, but it also helps, us to work for and fight for. It's all about working for workers, right? And fighting for all workers in necessary ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's inclusive in the union, and it's radical in addressing the context in which the union has to be inclusive.
Yes.
Right? What's the context that the union exists in, and what are the things they have to work against to be inclusive, and then how do we get rid of those things? How do we work against those things? And so there's a inherent power analysis here that is foundational that I think isn't always there with the way that he described other unionisms.
Yes.
Unionisms.
It
Yeah.
is.
One of the things I want to talk about is another form of unionism that he mentioned, and it's labor liberalism.
Yes.
Which is a framework that popped up in the 90s after the waves of the more conservative labor framework called business unionism, which you mentioned. And so labor liberalism shows up and sounds like a change to the way things were working, but it ends up just reinforcing the status quo of labor movement work, just kind of jimmying the outside a little bit.
Right?
They're trying to shake the door so it works a little bit better, but nothing really changed about the door. And it's still broken. So they did feature more progressive policy positions around immigration and race and gender than business unionism, but ultimately it's more about working within the economic frameworks that already exist. It's not something that is going to challenge the foundations of the status quo much at all. So Joe Burns says, quote, "Labor liberalism attempts to straddle between two worldviews, class struggle unionism and business unionism. And like many attempts at compromise, it fails." His point about failing is that it hasn't generated conflict with business unionists, which typified unionism in the early to mid 20th century, where the AFL and the IWW were in open conflict pretty regularly.
Right.
Like the AFL scabbed on IWW strikes, and then the business unionists used the Red Scare in the 40s and the 50s to further antagonize and marginalize the class struggle unionists, which we alluded to in other episodes. We've talked about the working class. Like that Red Scare really did a number on a lot of working class progress.
Yes.
And has held that back and changed the way that labor can legally operate today in a lot of ways, which was another part of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of why this book is so great. I'm so glad you brought up labor liberalism. And as I said at the top, this idea that he presents this history of unionism. And so he walks us through how this has evolved over the years and what came from these different forms of unionism. And so I'm glad you brought up labor unionism for that. I think, there was a lot of promise with labor liberalism. It's sort of this idea of being an evolution of unionism and what it tried to do. But you're absolutely right. And Joe Burns sort of talks about this so brilliantly in the book. And one of the things that I was struck by, it reminded me of this connection here between this and the notion of abolition versus reforms. Right?
Yeah, connection.
There's a connection there. But this idea of trying to work within the existing economic framework was never going to produce the wins that real people, real workers needed. So I read that and paused a little bit and thought about the connections there. There was this other great quote. I think this was actually back from the introduction, so I'm jumping all over the place. Joe Burns says this, quote, "The dividing line between business unionism and class struggle unionism was simple. Whether you accepted the very right of management to exploit labor of working people. The business unionists said, sure, as long as they got a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, they would accept management's control of the workplace and the economy. Class struggle unionists said, no, labor creates all wealth, and viewed their unionism as one part of a bigger struggle against the billionaires class." Mm-hmm. And so I think, a huge weakness of the labor movement in the 90s, as you brought up, was that it didn't center class and class struggle and all of the issues that come with that. And so, again, I just wanted to share that connection that I saw to abolition, but also I think this just is another continued compelling reasoning for embracing class struggle unionism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think, one of the things we talked about was, or one of the things he talked about was the way that labor liberalism, like you said, appeared to be a reform, but was really a compromise and trying to find a middle ground between these two diametrically opposed theories. But when you do that, you really just end up being closer to the more conservative side of those theories. And that's really what happened in not centering class and really staffing unions with paid staff members instead of it being led by like rank and file members and stuff. So there's a lot of that in there that he does a really great job of illustrating how that all has shifted into that sort of new framework. And another really important point that he makes is that the game is currently rigged, which I alluded to a little bit ago. We've had decades of right-wing reactionary policy implemented to cut into the effectiveness of the labor movement.
Yes.
And he says, quote, "Labor law is completely geared toward employers. Employers are allowed to legally permanently replace striking workers. Workplace-based solidarity is largely outlawed, and employers can get injunctions against mass picketing." Yeah. And these are all huge obstacles to overcome. They're designed to isolate different union workplaces from each other rather than demonstrate solidarity.
Right.
And stopping mass picketing then reduces the amount of visibility of the strike and allows business to continue as normal, which is one of the points of a strike, is that business doesn't go on as normal.
Right.
And he goes on to say, quote, "We have 100 years of history to show that working people make substantial gains only when they struggle to break free of imposed legal limitations. There is zero chance that we can revive unionism within existing labor law, and the prospect for meaningful labor reform is equally dim."
Wow.
So he goes on to talk about the ways that, he mentions injunctions against mass picketing. If you violate those injunctions, there's huge fines that would bankrupt a lot of unions, that, makes it prohibitively expensive to justify violating the injunction. But he talks about we have to find ways to operate outside of these injunctions, operate outside of the legal framework that currently exists, because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere with what we need for real working class justice, real working class liberation, because it's the legal system the way it is set up to favor the billionaires, to favor the employers, and we can't operate within a system where the game is rigged like that.
Absolutely. And talk about favoring the billionaires, and we think about, and we know how oftentimes the billionaires are often in the politicians' pockets as well. And so you talked about this right-wing reactionary policy to curtail their effectiveness. Like, that's also at play too, right? Like, that's also great. To me, it's just yet another reason why we need radical ideas, radical vision, radical work like this to bring about the changes we need in the labor movement. And that's what class struggle unionism is all about, I think. So that's really good stuff. Well, this probably is a good place to switch gears, I think, and talk about application. I feel like you already started us on the path here, which is great. Gold star for you. Application is where we talk about how this book and our conversation about it applies to our everyday lives. My application is that I think in so many ways, this book made it clear to me that class struggle unionism highlights, the urgency that exists for the work. And we are all connected in the struggles that class struggle unionism is trying to address and fight for. And so I think we have to all be in this together. And we all have to recognize that as people who work, we all spend, I think, so much of our time working. We spend so much of our lives at work, and we all have these lives that we're trying to live both at work, but also outside of work as well. And so for me, this idea of embracing the work of class struggle unionism is a no-brainer. And certainly it's just kind of the application of this book. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think he talks about all the ways that we have to adjust the way that unionism is currently working.
Yes.
And, he talks about, we didn't talk about like the militant, I forgot the term, but there's a group of militants within your organization that are pushing the organization to further the class struggle unionism approach.
Right.
There's all kinds of stuff. So yeah, great stuff. My application comes from the last few lines of the book,
Okay.
where he says, quote, "We know from history that real change happens when ordinary working people refuse to accept their conditions, when millions rise up against exploitation and demand a better world. We also know the class struggle unionism is a powerful ideology, one hated and feared by the billionaire class. We have a world to win, and the future is bright."
Oh, he said that much better than I did.
Yeah, well, yeah. That's why he writes the books.
That's right, he writes the books. Yeah.
That's why Haymarket, publishes his books.
That's right. Shout out Haymarket.
Yeah, that so perfectly encapsulates what's important about unionism and about challenging the status quo for regular people. We
Yes.
have to be based in solidarity, not only in the workplace, not only in unionism, but also in the bigger sense of the world. Like, as we approach anything, we have to be based in solidarity, even if we're not the ones who are currently on the receiving end of whatever that system is.
Absolutely.
Right? Like I've said many times, the system can be tweaked to be targeting you
Yep.
with just a few small changes. And we have to
Absolutely.
recognize that and see that, I think this is an old union slogan, but an injury to one is an injury to all.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely. I love that. We have to be based in solidarity.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, good application. Let's hope we got some good homework here. What do we want to do when we leave the table today to continue our learning? This is so random, but I was doing some research earlier and I stumbled upon another great book. That sounds really great.
No way.
I
More
know,
books.
right? More books. Could be a great way, I think, to continue our learning about it. And it's not his book. This book is called Fight Like Hell: The Untold History of American Labor. It was written by Kim Kelly. And I just briefly read, I didn't pull the review for this moment or the description for this moment, but from what I remember, it seems like a compelling book and another way to continue our learning. So I want to check
just from the
that
title.
out.
Yeah.
Fight Like Hell, I'm in. So I want to check that out. I also know that Joe Burns included so many references and examples of strikes and labor organizing and unions throughout that I learned about for the first time reading this book. So I want to spend some time, go back into this book, then, hit up the internet and do some more learning from all the things that he shared in this great book. So that's my homework. What about you?
Yeah. So he mentions another book that he wrote called Reviving the Strike,
Yes.
which I now want to read,
Yes.
especially in the context of reading the section that's in this book called How to Win Strikes, which puts the tactics of a strike into context in a way that I haven't learned about before, but he spells out specifically what seems obvious after you read it, which is that, quote, "A successful strike must impede the profit-making ability of the employer by preventing either production or distribution of products and services."
Yeah.
So, on one hand, duh.
Right.
On the other hand, yeah, yes.
Right, for
Absolutely.
it to matter, for it to
For
make
it
a
to matter,
difference,
that's
right, for it to
what
produce
has to
change,
happen.
that has to happen. Absolutely.
So my homework is learning more about strikes from Joe Burns and his other book called Reviving the Strike.
I love it. We'll add it to the list. All right, Aaron, my friend, you're up next time.
Yeah.
What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing Interrupting Criminalization's Abolition in the State, which they describe as a discussion tool that was released last fall.
Okay.
We talked about it a few weeks back when we read What Time Is It on the Clock of Abolitionist Organizing from Andrea Ritchie, which was published in The Forge.
That's right.
And to give some context, I pulled this from the introduction. As movements to defund and divest from policing and invest in community safety expand in the wake of the 2020 uprisings, abolitionist organizers are increasingly grappling with questions around the role of the state in abolitionist futures, including, what do we imagine, advocate for, instead of policing and police? What actions and behaviors do we think should be regulated by the state? How should they be regulated? Who should be involved? What should they be empowered to do? How do we think resources should be distributed? By whom and how? Our answers to these questions profoundly shape our organizing objectives and strategies and the context in which they unfold. This discussion tool provides room for readers to ask and explore generative questions that open up the multitude of possibilities, both drawing from and moving beyond existing analyses and frameworks. So that sounds great.
Brilliant.
Excited to talk about
Absolutely.
that and learn from it. And not to give the game away too much, but I believe we're going to follow up this discussion next week with one of the other things from Interrupting Criminalization, which was a follow-up zine to this discussion guide that they released a few months back. So yeah, we've got the next couple weeks laid out for us.
I'm excited about that. Thanks for remembering to bring that back to the table for us. I'm so looking forward to that. Interrupting Criminalization is just a really profound organization doing some great stuff. So,
and there's so much.
There's so much
that they're releasing. Like it's just remarkable how much of a resource that they are to abolitionist movement work.
Yeah. I'm glad that we're able to amplify it here on our little show. Very good. All right. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you've forgotten, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on the socials, check us out on YouTube, and sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. And we'll talk to you next week.